Today we are going to revisit an old topic, but one that has a new twist. And that is the follow-up of the COVID protests in Ottawa, the Freedom Convoy from back in February. And I want to spend some time just talking about what new information we've heard on that subject and try to tie it in with some of the old information that we've given to you before. Welcome back. So today we are going to revisit an old topic, but one that has a new twist. And that is the follow-up of the COVID protests in Ottawa, the Freedom Convoy from back in February. And as you probably have heard about in the news more recently, they've just finished the public hearings section of the Emergencies Act. Inquiry is being handled by Justice Paul Rollo. And I want to spend some time just talking about what new information we've heard on that subject and try to tie it in with some of the old information that we've given to you before. So let's start this way. Back in February, as you'll recall, in the face of the COVID mandates that the federal government in particular had imposed, there was a large-scale protest that unfolded in Ottawa. It was not necessarily a planned event that had a coherent agenda. It was just a lot of people coming together that were upset by what was happening with the imposition of mandates and the curtailing of our freedoms by the federal government. So what we observed was numerous people and vehicles in the central area of Ottawa and creating blockage of roads, causing a lot of interest that was being provoked among the public who were taking sides on this issue. So I want to emphasize a few points on this. Number one, it was a peaceful protest. I don't think there's any reasonable dispute about that. The people who protested were generally very well behaved. They parked their vehicles in downtown Ottawa that may have amounted to parking infractions, but not something that rose to criminal level, apart from a very few minor incidents that occurred. But the way the news media approached it was skewed in an extreme fashion. I recall one criminologist professor, I believe from the University of Ottawa, who talked about one incident where it was said that a protester had attacked a police officer riding on a horse. And what we found out subsequently is that the officer had driven the horse into the crowd and actually seriously injured a woman, knocking her to the ground. But that kind of distortion of the event in the news media was happening pervasively. And this was by CTV, by CBC, and the Toronto Star in particular took very adversarial roles against the Freedom Convoy protesters. And I think in a way that was very unfair and biased. And that raises a connection that is very timely now as I'm doing this program, and that is the recent revelations that Twitter has censored conservative voices and conservative commentators and has promoted more radical left-wing agendas. And that is really exactly what was happening in this protest. If you listen to CBC or listen to CTV or read the Toronto Star, you will see how distorted their perspectives were. And I have numerous articles with me today that talk about that. One article that talks about the CIBC having to retract some of its allegations with respect to the convoy. And falsehoods that were being betrayed in the media by some news organizations. The Toronto Sun, which by and large I think covered it quite fairly, had a number of excellent articles in that regard by Lauren Gunter is one of the articles I have with me today, and there are others as well. So the bias of the news media in portraying what happened in Ottawa with the Freedom Convoy is inexcusable, and that in itself is an affront to freedom of expression and an unbiased news media, which is really a cornerstone of our democratic process. So falsehoods were propounded by news media organizations when the events were happening. We know that the federal government chose to enact a very special measure to deal with what was essentially a peaceful protest called the Emergencies Act, which I'm going to talk to you about in just a minute. But I want to note how that particularly Justin Trudeau refused to meet with any of the protesters, refused to discuss with them ways of resolving the issues, was predisposed very negatively against them, and so used language that this was a fringe minority of unacceptable views. And I think the very fact of the size of the protests in Ottawa, the other subsets of protests that took place in Coutts, Alberta, and in other locations, and frankly on a prolonged basis, even after February, that was still unfolding, shows just how powerful this popular uprising in support of freedoms was. But Justin Trudeau chose not to deal with them in a reasonable way, and took a view of them that was clearly very skewed and biased adversarially against them. So the federal government enacted the Emergencies Act. What is that? Well, this was a legislation that I believe I'm correct in saying had never been used before this time. A similar piece of legislation, the War Measures Act, had been enacted, interestingly, by Justin Trudeau's father about 3 decades ago in the face of the FLQ crisis in Quebec, which involved concerted violence, which involved kidnappings, which involved the murders of James Cross and Pierre Laporte, serious uprisings and legal infractions that ultimately included murder. And so the War Measures Act was enacted in that context. Is that equivalent to what was happening with the Freedom Convoy? Of course not. Of course not. As I've said to you already, what happened in the Freedom Convoy was a peaceful protest, and clearly Mr. Trudeau had predisposed adversarial views against them. So what has happened in the inquiry that we've just seen wrap up as far as the public phase? Well, we see some news article that talk about how that the police really made poor decisions and enacted poor planning in dealing with the events. I have a number of articles with me that talk about that. Here's one that talks about the police had no real plan. The Ottawa police actually were conflictual with the OPP and other agencies entrusted to deal with the situation potentially. Some testimony at the hearing indicated that the OPP took the position that the Emergencies Act was not needed. In fact, I hold in front of me an article that says exactly that the OPP position, interestingly, was that the Emergencies Act was not required for the situation. So when the Ontario Provincial Police Force actually takes the position that it was not necessary, that should raise some eyebrows as to what the federal government was doing. So what we largely hear is that the police were acting incompetently and with poor planning and strategy to deal with this event. And yet we see that the federal government has in past occurrences with Indigenous disputes, in railway shutdowns and other events that have occurred with Indigenous protests, have let those carry on for some time without enacting measures such as the Emergencies Act. So one has to question the balance that the federal government used and whether enacting such a draconian provision which seized bank accounts of protesters, which towed away vehicles, arrested people. These actions under the Emergencies Act, I suggest to you, were not necessary and were ill-conceived. And we do not know the findings at this time, of course, of the inquiry, but I suggest, based on the evidence that we've heard so far, that the likely outcome should be that this provision should not have been enacted. And yet, the Prime Minister very self-righteously says, I made the right choice. This is from a leader who told us he had some adverse feelings about the protesters early on. So he didn't have an unbiased perspective. And in his own mind, he can rationalize and justify his actions to say he made the right choice. But I suggest to you that most of the evidence clearly tells us that what he did was not appropriate in law, was not founded properly in law, and was enacted in a manner that imposed draconian steps that had not previously been enacted for a similar type of event, and caused further injustice to what already was happening to people who were simply trying to demonstrate for the principle of freedom, the backbone of our democracy. And the federal government failed the test. And the Prime Minister, as has been his pattern in a number of steps that he's taken, again demonstrates poor decision-making and indeed a threat to the way that our democracy functions. So I hope that you think about these steps and what it can mean even going forward when such a powerful legislation can be enacted with such little recourse and ability for people to simply defend their reasonable freedoms. Thanks for listening to us on this program. I hope this information gives you some points to ponder as we talk about our important issues in our society today. Thanks for now.